Das wird aufgezeichnet. And you're good to go. Okay.
Hi everybody, it's Kylie here. Can you all hear me? You can send a little message if you like.
I can hear you, Kylie.
Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to welcome you all to the Method Seminar today. As you know, these Method Seminars are organised between the Donau-Universität in Krems here in Austria, the Sheps Centre for Health Services Research at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and RTI International, which is headquartered in Raleigh, North Carolina. And of course we welcome all individuals from other organisations to attend in person here or of course online. Before I introduce today's presenter, I'd like to remind everybody that we are tuned in using phones or headsets. If you want to answer your phone or speak with somebody, or if it gets loud wherever you are, then please mute your microphone. I'd also like to remind everybody that we do record these seminars and we do publish them as slidecasts, but we do not record the discussion afterwards. So today's seminar will be given by Professor Michael Kundi from the Medical University of Vienna. He's really a high-profile gentleman here in Austria, so we're really delighted to welcome him here for this Method Seminar. He's the head of the Institute of Environmental Health of the Medical University of Vienna. Before that, he was the head of the Department for Social and Occupational Health. He's a member of the Working Group on Electromagnetic Fields, also the National Vaccination Committee of the Highest Health Council and the Ministry of Health in Austria, head of the Toxicology Working Group. He's a member of the Environmental Health Assessment Groups of the World Health Organization, a founding member of BioInitiative. He's been teaching environmental medicine and public health and has taught several master's courses in Austria, Germany and Switzerland. And he also leads the PhD program of public health at the Medical University of Vienna. And this is quite incredible. He's published over 350 journal articles, and these articles have been cited over 5,000 times, which is really amazing. Thank you so much for being with us today, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I was asked to present the procedure of evaluating the evidence of environmental health risks, and I'd like to start with the famous, oh, there is a problem with the presentation. Yeah. Okay. I'd like to start with the famous Red Book of the National Research Council in the US. It's about risk assessment in the federal government. And this was a seminal work that has been done in the year 1983, and we still rely on the basics of this Red Book. I'd use the mouse to point out some important things. First of all, we start with basic research. It's epidemiological studies of occupational and environmental health risks. It's studies in the laboratory, whether in humans or in animals, but mostly it's long-term animal studies that are of importance here, and then studies of the modes of action, mainly in vitro studies, and also assessment of the exposure, measurements and characterization of the exposure in humans. And based on this research, the risk assessment is starting doing a hazard identification. That means which type of exposures are posing a health hazard, also which health relevant effects are occurring, and also about the aspects of the exposure that are related to the hazard. And together with mechanistic data, this leads to the hazard characterization. And the exposure appraisal is also an important step where the occupational and environmental exposure conditions are delineated. And all these different aspects are then entered into the risk characterization. And this risk characterization should then inform the risk management process where regulatory options are developed and also possible consequences of different options are assessed. And then a decision is made by either governmental or other bodies about action or inaction. So the scientifically relevant steps in the assessment of an environmental agent where an association has been found to a disease or to several diseases is whether chance, bias or confounding can explain this association or whether there is a causal relationship. And all these different aspects, these 4 different possibilities to explain an association should be evaluated based on the scientific knowledge. Which different types of studies are relevant for assessing an association? Most importantly, it's epidemiological studies. These are investigations of long-term effects on health and well-being in large groups of the population. But also provocation studies are of importance where short and medium-term effects are assessed with respect to psychological and physiological effects. And as I mentioned previously, animal studies are used to investigate the relationship between exposure and effect under controlled conditions. And for mechanistic purposes, it's important to have also in vitro studies about effects in isolated cells or tissues. So what is the difference? You are used to assessing the effects of medical interventions. What is the difference between the assessment of environmental agents and of medical interventions? Medical interventions are typically assessed before humans are exposed to a potential risk. Each intervention is tested comprehensively. You know the steps of the procedure from phase 0 to phase 3 studies until market authorization is granted. And after introduction to the market, phase 4 studies are initiated often so that a market authorization can be based on a balance of risks and benefits. And the assessment is a priori. That means it's before it is introduced. This is different in environmental agents because these are typically investigated only after humans have been exposed to the risk. And these agents are typically not tested comprehensively unless there is an indication of harm prior to its introduction. And also the exposure of man-made sources doesn't depend on an assessment of benefits and risks, and the assessment is in most cases a posteriori, that is after it has been introduced. So I was thinking about how can we transform the process of assessment of medical interventions where we are used to asking PICO questions how this transfers into the assessment of environmental agents, and this can be stated as PACO questions maybe. For, you know, in medical interventions, these PICO questions, for which population is the intervention intended, which intervention is tested, against which comparator and which outcome is relevant. This is also important for environmental agents. Which population is exposed to the agent? This is an important question. Also, of course, what is the agent that is actually tested and against which it is compared, and what outcome is relevant. So these questions are also relevant for environmental agents, although they are not posed in this type of formalism. So asking these PACO questions, which population is exposed? Are there specific occupational groups, for example, that are exposed to the risk, or the population next to a facility often identified as a point source, or are consumers or users of a certain product the population that is exposed? But often it is the general population. We have often ubiquitous exposure, like exposure to particulate matter, where we have exposure all over the world, even in so-called clean areas. And finally, we often assess vulnerable subgroups of the population, children, elderly, or persons with chronic diseases. Which is the agent that is tested? This depends often on the prevalence and the magnitude of the exposure. So, and it depends also on the availability of scientific investigations. These investigations are often only conducted after pressure from citizen groups or consumer organizations, sometimes by industry and other stakeholders. But there are also, of course, governmental interests that might have an impact on the availability of scientific investigations. And the least important, maybe, I'm sorry to say, are scientific interests, because what we are interested is often of no interest for stakeholders, and then such investigations don't get funded. Ideally, if we ask against which comparator the agent is tested, it should be the non-exposed population. So individuals that have no difference to exposed ones, but are non-exposed. So this is an ideal situation that we rarely encounter. So most typically it's those that are exposed at background levels. And sometimes we also have compared to individuals that are exposed to other agents, especially in occupational settings. Next question, which outcome is relevant? Unfortunately, a science-based answer to that question is often impossible, because we have no a priori knowledge about the mechanisms of action. So what is the toxicokinetics and toxicodynamics of the human exposure? So therefore, we try to find the most sensitive outcome, and also are interested whether outcomes have a threshold of effects or not. Also outcomes that are relevant with respect to mechanistic considerations about the mode of action, and of course outcomes that are relevant for the assessment of health risks. So these are a reformulation of the PICO questions for the situation of environmental health risk assessment. Like in other areas, often there is no agreement about an issue of health problems of exposure. And this illustrates this quite well. The scientific community is divided. Some say this stuff is dangerous, some say it isn't. So often if there are large economical pressures in the direction of a product or an agent, this is especially pronounced, this scientific disagreement. In an introduction to the WHO air quality guidelines, the problem is specified quite nicely. They are stating that in order to produce a standard with high probability of offering safety, we should have knowledge about a lot of things where we are usually not having complete understanding. And because of lack of such data, we have to use scientific judgment and consensus. And this is maybe different from other areas where we do assessing the evidence. We have to use also value judgments. For example, the use of subjective terms like adverse effects or what is sufficient evidence and so on. Such value judgments are unavoidable in this area due to the scarcity of data on all these different aspects that are important for a complete understanding of human health risks. Who is evaluating the evidence? It's mainly two groups, the national and international organizations and different groups of scientists that do independent evaluation and evaluations and publish them in the peer-reviewed literature. Among the national and international organizations, most importantly, are the WHO organizations like IARC, it's the International Agency for Research on Cancer. This organization issues hazard characterizations for environmental agents and occupational agents. But other groups of WHO, for example, they compile the environmental health criteria. These are comprehensive risk assessment procedures and also WHO guidelines that include, in addition to a risk assessment, also exposure guidelines. And then from national organizations, most importantly in the USA, there is the National Toxicology Program. It also issues hazard characterizations. The US EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, or the different occupational commissions in the different countries, for example in Austria and Germany, the MAC Commission, and in America the OSHA, the Organization for the Safety and Health, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. These different groups are assessing occupational agents mainly. And then, as I mentioned before, different groups of scientists that also do such evaluation of the evidence and publish this in the peer-reviewed literature. Concerning all of these different agents, there are different classification systems. Here are examples of classification systems for carcinogenic risk assessment. This classification system from IARC, from the International Agency for Research on Cancer of WHO, they have a 5-tier classification system. From group 1, the agent is carcinogenic to human. Group 2, that is divided in 2 subgroups, A and B, that's the agent is probably or possibly carcinogenic to humans. Then group 3, the agent is not classifiable. And group 4, the agent is probably not carcinogenic to humans. The US EPA, for the same purpose, uses a 6-tier, that is group A, then that's a human carcinogen. Group B is divided in 2 subgroups, probable human carcinogen, and based on human data. And group B2 is a human carcinogen, probable human carcinogen, that is assessment is based on animal data. And then a possible human carcinogen, not classifiable, and evidence of non-carcinogenicity. So this is similar to group 3 and 4 of IARC. And another one still is from the US Governmental Industrial Hygienists. There's also an organization that is assessing the evidence for carcinogenic risks. You see they have also a 5-tier, similar to the other groups, but they have an assessment as a confirmed human carcinogen, as suspected ones, then a confirmed one in animals with unknown relevance to humans, a not classifiable one as human carcinogen, and not suspected as a human carcinogen. And interestingly, this 5-tier is similar to the assessment that is done in the European Union for carcinogenic risks. So what is the relationship between the evidence and these classifications? As an example, I show you the relationship between evidence and classification for the IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And as you see here, each classification, remember that group 1 is a human carcinogen, so the highest classification, and this can be issued if there is sufficient evidence from epidemiology only. So another possibility is that there is less than sufficient evidence in humans from epidemiological studies, but sufficient evidence in animal experiments and strong support from mechanistic studies. So in these 2 cases, either if there is sufficient evidence in humans from epidemiological studies, or there is less than sufficient evidence, but animal experiments are of sufficient evidence with strong support from mechanistic studies. If one of these combinations of evidence holds, then a group 1 classification is delineated. And you see for the other classifications, there are other combinations of these different sources of evidence. Like, for example, for group 2A, if there is limited evidence in epidemiology, but sufficient evidence from animal experiments, then a group 2A can be assigned. But even if there is inadequate evidence from epidemiology, but sufficient evidence from animal experiments with strong support from mechanistic studies, then it can also be classified as a group 2A. That's a assignment of a probable human carcinogen, and so on. Interestingly, if you look into group 4, that is probably non-carcinogenic to humans, then there has to be evidence for lack of carcinogenicity from human studies and evidence for lack of carcinogenicity in animal experiments. Or there has to be evidence for lack of carcinogenicity in animal experiments with strong evidence against carcinogenicity from mechanistic studies. So even if there is no evidence in humans, the evidence from animal experiments and in vitro studies or mechanistic studies might be sufficient for a group 4 assignment. We use, or let's say most organizations that are assessing the evidence use a weight of evidence approach. That means there is a certain characterization of the evidence that leads to a certain weight for the overall assessment. And this leads then into a classification. And this is the weight of evidence approach of the International Agency for Research on Cancer. So sufficient evidence from epidemiological studies is provided if there is a positive relationship observed between exposure and cancer in studies in which chance, bias and confounding could be ruled out with reasonable confidence. So it doesn't state what actually means that chance, bias and confounding can be ruled out, because this is the task of the working group that is assessing the evidence. So we have no precise definition of what is sufficient. It's an evaluation by a group of scientists. Typically the groups of IAC have around 30 members, so there has to be agreement among these members that the chance, bias and confounding can be ruled out. And the next is then limited evidence, so that although there is a assessment by the working group that the causal interpretation is possible, but in chance, bias and confounding cannot be ruled out with reasonable confidence, then it's limited evidence. And you see the most comprehensive assessment would be suggesting lack of carcinogenicity. There must be a number of different lines of evidence that is showing that there is no relationship in humans. The same type of relationship between the characterization of the evidence and the category is also for animal studies. For example, a sufficient evidence for a relationship in animal experiments is assigned if there is an increased incidence of tumors in the exposed animals, at least in 2 species, or in 2 independent investigations in 1 species carried out at different times or in different labs or under different protocols, or in both sexes of a single species, and also if there is only 1 study in 1 species and the malignant neoplasms occur in very high degree. So this was necessary due to the long-term studies here that have shown, for example, in the National Toxicology Program of the US, such relationships, and it was thought that this would be sufficient for the characterization of the evidence in these cases. So if you have a very strong carcinogenic agent, you find at many different sites a large increase in the evidence of tumors. Mechanistic studies are also assessed, as I mentioned in the overview, and there we have categories of strong support, moderate support, and weak support, or no support or strong evidence against carcinogenicity. And the strongest indication that there is a carcinogenic risk in humans is that if it is shown that there is a mechanism that operates in humans that is derived from data on biological tissues where it is found that a certain effect occurs that is known to be related to cancer. So for example, if you find a certain metabolic activation that causes alkylation of the DNA, then this is such a strong supporting mechanistic information. Now I will show you a brief overview of the types of studies that have to be evaluated during the risk assessment procedure in environmental agents. So the epidemiological studies that are relevant here are cohort studies, case control, and cross-sectional studies. You find similar types of studies also in clinical epidemiology, but there are some differences in environmental agents studies. It's especially also the duration of these studies. So the cohort studies, as you know, start from a target population where a sample is drawn, and you have different exposure categories or non-exposed groups in this sample, and then you follow these selected subjects over a certain period of time until the endpoint occurs. So the endpoint in these cases are certain diseases. So you follow them up for a period of time and assess the occurrence of the diseases. So this is a prospective type of study. The case control studies are retrospective. They also start from the target population, but they start with the already deceased person. So they select the deceased persons from the target population, match them to controls that are selected randomly, and then they have the cases and the controls, and then retrospectively the exposure is assessed. So this is a retrospective type study, and the cross-sectional study is either done by aggregated data or individual data. Here you have also a target population where a sample might be drawn, and the difference to the case control studies here is that you assess the exposure and the endpoint at the same time in these selected subjects. The cross-sectional studies can also be done on aggregated data, that is without assessing individuals, but groups of individuals. Here is an example from our own research. This was started in 1950, not by us, of course, because I was just born in 1950, but by scientists of the Austrian Compensation Board, and they handed over the data to us. And this was started in 1950 in men that were 40 years of age at that time, and these were 1,640 dust workers and matched controls. And they were followed up by us until, you see, the 1990s, and again until 2004, so when virtually all of these workers have died already. And you see here one of the main results. These are Kaplan-Meier curves of the life expectancy of these individuals. And you see that the dust exposed are median die 3 or 4 years earlier. So this shows that these workers that are exposed to occupational dust are at greater risk, and this difference in life expectancy is due to stomach cancer, lung cancer, and also deaths from other respiratory diseases. What are the advantages and disadvantages of this study type? Of course, the observation follows the path of time, and therefore a causal interpretation is easier. But as shown in this example, such studies might be very, very long. So most diseases of interest have very long latencies. So cancer with 20 to 50 years of latency, or other chronic diseases with similar latencies. And in order to have a chance to detect a sufficient number of cases, you need a very long study duration. And also, of course, for rare diseases, it's difficult because you need very, very large samples, like 1 million of individuals. And you might imagine what the problems arise if you try to follow up 1 million of the population. There are some risk of bias, selection bias, mainly that the cohorts at the start of the study already differ in relevant features, or most importantly attrition bias, that you lose subjects in the follow-up procedure, and this might be related to the exposure. And also disease misclassification is an issue, that you do not detect sufficient number of cases because of failure of diagnosis. An example for a case control study is the so-called KIC study. It's children and nuclear power plants. It's a study in Germany, around 16 nuclear power plants. They defined study regions as 3 counties surrounding each nuclear power plant. And here the primary endpoint was cancer, especially childhood leukemia. And they studied children that are younger than 5 years of age during a period of more than 20 years. And here you see the outcome in relation to the distance from the power plant. You have a declining risk the larger the distance from this nuclear power plant. So there is a clear association between distance and cancer risk. The advantage of the case control studies are, of course, that they are shorter in study duration, because you start from the already diagnosed cases. It's also suitable for rare diseases because the disease must be already diagnosed, and so you can find by combining data from different countries, for example, sufficient number of cases to do such an investigation. If you use incidence density sampling, or if you start with rare diseases, then you can also estimate relative risk that is an important indicator of the amount of a risk. The disadvantage is that the exposure assessment is retrospective, and therefore a causal interpretation is more difficult. And also in this type of study we have some risks of bias. Again, a selection bias, only that here the composition of the groups of cases and controls might be different. Another issue is recall bias, because often you use individual recall of the exposure, and this might lead to a bias if, for example, the disease is associated with declining memory. And exposure misclassification is also a problem if you have differences in the methods to assess exposure in cases and controls, which is sometimes necessary. An example for cross-sectional studies is this study in Germany about radon and lung cancer. And you see here that there is a negative relationship between the radon concentration in these areas. These are aggregated data, the average radon exposure in different cities in Germany has been measured and then related to the mortality from lung cancer in these areas. And you see it seems as if radon protects against lung cancer, because the larger the exposure, the smaller the risk. But on the other hand, you see, as lung cancer is confounded by tobacco smoking, there is a large positive correlation between the number of smokers and the mortality from lung cancer. And this causes a problem in these types of studies that is called an ecological fallacy. And this is shown here. It's sometimes also called the Simpson's paradox. You might have a positive correlation between exposure and the disease in all subgroups, but if you combine these subgroups, as in this example you see, you have a negative correlation. And in this case, the difference between these groups is in the frequency of smokers. So in this group you have the highest incidence of smokers, and so the overall risk is shifted to higher risks, and so you can have such a negative correlation, although within each group you have a positive relationship. But otherwise, if you can avoid such bias or such risk of bias, the cross-sectional approach is very efficient. Now, the second type of evidence is from provocation studies. What is the nature of these studies? They are done to assess the toxicokinetics and toxicodynamics, to determine acute levels of toxicity and so on. And as an example, you see here a relationship between a short-term exposure to ethylbenzene and hearing loss. This is the percentage of outer hair cell loss. So of course you cannot have more than 100%. Therefore, you see these curves have 100% as the upper limit. But you see, depending on the duration, this is a 13 weeks experiment and this is only 5 days. But in both, you see a strong dose-response relationship. Here, these points are the medians, and this is the 10 to 90th percentile in these exposed animals. And you see there is a strong dose-response relationship. Now to the long-term animal studies. I will do this a bit faster. I give you as an example the NTP assay. That's the assay from the National Toxicology Program, because it is quite interesting, in my opinion, to see the whole procedure. It starts with an interagency review, a selection of agents that should be tested, and an assignment to a lead scientist is also done at this step. And this is open to the public, actually, so also the public can suggest which agents should be tested. In the next step, there is an assembly of a study team, then preliminary investigations are done mainly based on the literature, but also by contact with the manufacturers and regulatory bodies. Then a study protocol is developed, but also the analytical tools have often to be developed, and the monitoring procedure and the design of the toxicokinetic studies, because this NTP assay includes also the toxicokinetics evaluation. And then the pre-chronic toxicity studies are done typically for 14 or 28 days. Then a pre-chronic toxicity study with a duration of 3 months is done. And finally, a lifelong chronic exposure study that lasts for 2 years. And typically 2 strains are assessed. It's a strain of rats and a strain of mice. Also typically we have 3 doses and a control in males and females of rats and mice, and at each dose 50 to 100 animals are investigated. Here you see the time protocol. During the first weeks there are at predefined intervals measurements in different tissues, and finally after 2 years the surviving animals are killed, or those that are showing signs of severe disease are killed in between, and a complete histopathology is performed in these animals. So starting from very young age until 2 years, they have continuous exposure to the agent. Then the data are analyzed, a draft technical report is produced, and this is published in the web so that everybody can read it and can make statements about that. So finally it is reviewed by a subcommittee of NTP, and this is an open public session. 1 to 2 of these sessions occur each year. And then the agent is assigned in one of the different categories, from no evidence to equivocal, some or clear evidence of carcinogenicity. So this is how it is done. But of course there is the problem from mouse to man or from animal to man, but we start from the assumption that all living beings are similar, and the closer these animals are to humans, the higher the similarity, but this is not true all the time. For example, some metabolic pathways are present in rats but not in mice and humans, and so there can be also fallacy in the assignment. So finally, in vitro studies, I have some examples here, but I go fast over that. Now, how is the evaluation done of all these different bodies of evidence, all these different types of investigations? And I'm sorry to say that there is rarely a systematic literature search in these cases, mainly because the evaluating scientists are experts in the field and they know the literature by heart, so there is no need to do such a systematic literature review. But often the procedure is by contacting the experts in the field around the world and asking to submit the relevant literature. That's the way how it is done by WHO, for example. Predominantly the peer-reviewed original research articles are used, but also other documents like the NTP reports, because also these reports underwent a comprehensive review process. After a draft is produced, some of these reviewing bodies send the documents out for check of completeness and for comments. So this is the way the evidence is evaluated usually. The appraisal of each research paper is typically done by a narrative summary, and this includes the group's assessment of the most relevant outcomes, but also the strengths and limitations are mentioned, and there is also the risk of bias that is assessed. And typically the summary of the results is by endpoint and by type of investigation. So you find different assessment for the epidemiological, for the animals, and for the in vitro studies. This is an example of an environmental health criteria of WHO. It has a summary, it has some statements about the physical and chemical properties of the substance, the sources of human exposure, how it is transformed or distributed in the environment, what are the levels of human exposure. Then there is a chapter on the kinetics and metabolism in humans and in laboratory animals. Then a chapter on the effects in laboratory mammals and in vitro test systems, effects in humans, effects on other organisms. And then there is an evaluation of the human health risks and effects on the environment. That's ecotoxicological assessment. And finally, there are conclusions and recommendations for protection of human health and for the environment. And often it's also a statement about further research that is needed, and also evaluations by other bodies are reviewed. So this is the procedure in detail. I think it's difficult to read, but this is in the first steps, a draft is produced. This draft is then sent out for comments, and the comments are then worked into a final draft, and this final draft is then edited by the WHO group, and a final report is then published. Is there a grading procedure like in assessment of medical products? There is in some areas we have such grading procedures. This is, for example, the so-called Klimisch score. It is used, for example, by the European Chemical Association that is assessing chemicals in the context of the REACH process. And you see here there is a four-tier with a category of reliable evidence without restriction, reliable with restrictions, not reliable and not assignable. And this grading is for toxicological and ecotoxicological studies. It has been published by Klimisch and co-workers. They are from the BASF chemical industry, but although they are from industry, this grading procedure is widely used. I'm not quite in line with the arguments here in this grading procedure. You see there are a lot of subjective terms that, although they are unavoidable, should not be used for such gradings, like, for example, that there is no convincing documentation of an effect. What is convincing? Convincing is not a term that I would use in such grading procedures. Mainly, except for some special situations, there is no grading of recommendations. There is a grading sometimes of the evidence, but not of recommendations, like it is typically done in the assessment of medical interventions. This is partly due because in some areas, if there is certain evidence, this leads to legally defined restrictions, so there's no need for such grading. On the other hand, there are such guidelines that are recommended by scientific bodies are often turned into legally defined standards. For example, this was the case for air pollution standards. And the classification systems I have shown, they have evolved into a sort of grading of recommendations. Just briefly, if you have a group 1 or group 2A or group 2B assignment of agent as a carcinogenic risk, a group 1 often leads to limited or banned exposure, because then they are withdrawn from the market, such products. An example is asbestos. Or special care is taken that exposed workers are exposed at low levels only. This is for example, the case for cobalt, and also certain measurements are done in the work environment. An example for a Group 2B assignment is phthalates that have been banned for consumer products for children, for example. So, as you see, the recommendations, although they carry no grading, are in fact, if this assignment has been issued by one of these important bodies, then some effects occur on the market or on the workplace and so on. So this was a brief overview of how the evaluation is done, but there are still some fundamental problems. How can we be sure to have determined the most sensitive endpoint, for example? Or what is the nature of the dose-response function? This is very important for restricting the exposure. Are there especially sensitive subgroups of the population? And how does an agent act in combination with other agents? I go briefly through these problems, but cannot discuss them comprehensively. Here you see an example. This is this is exposure to mercury, and here you see the dose-response relationships of different endpoints from paresthesia to death. And we consider this as the most sensitive endpoint, but we are not sure. There might be other more sensitive endpoints. Often we have non-monotonous dose-response relationships because this might be an essential agent, like in this example. If you have too low levels of a vitamin or of an essential substance, you have an adverse effect. Then you have an optimal level where you have beneficial effects, and if you increase the exposure, it might again have adverse effects. But there are also other types of dose-response relationships, like in this example. You have an increase from very low dose levels of adverse effects, and then at a certain dose, then mechanisms are evoked by the organism to fight against the effects of the exposure, and the effect goes down. And then at a certain point, these defense mechanisms are exhausted, and you get an increase again. So you can expect very complex dose-response relationships. And even if the dose-response relationship is monotonous, there are quite a number of different types of such relationships. And if you observe in a certain range, for example, an almost linear relationship, it's no guarantee that below levels you can observe there is a completely different course of the function. Another important issue is differences between individuals. And in this example, you see we have a certain level where a toxic threshold is exceeded. And this is called the lowest observed adverse effect level. And then we have a safety margin, and this might be our reference level here. And as you can see, due to the variability between individuals, we have still a few individuals that, although they are exposed below this reference level, they are not protected. That is, they show a toxic response. And finally, the problem of combined effects. We are not exposed to one agent at one time, but to many different ones. And what about the combined effect? In this example, you see the estradiol effect, that is the natural occurring estrogen. And then you see the effect of the same dose of so-called xenoestrogens that are present in the environment. And you see the very low effect of all these different estrogens. But if you expose to all of these simultaneously, you get this effect here. So you have a very large increase of the effect, and this is due to the interaction at the site of the activity of these hormones. So it is often difficult to understand that even if you have an exposure well below the limit of detection of an adverse effect, a combination can exceed this level manifold. So therefore we have introduced uncertainty factors. These are the uncertainty factors as an example from the US Environmental Protection Agency. And this is sort of penalizing the lack of knowledge. You can, for certain uncertainty, like the uncertainty about the variation within the population of the sensitivity of subjects and or vulnerability, you assign a certain uncertainty factor if you have no evidence of the amount of variability. And also if you start from animal experiments and you have no data in humans, you have to apply such an uncertainty factor for the variation between species. And if you have observed only acute effect, then you need, in extrapolating to chronic effects, also an uncertainty factor. Then if you have only lowest observed effect levels, but no data about no observed effect levels, then you have also an uncertainty factor. And also if you have an incomplete database, for example, lacking information about combined effects, then you assign such an uncertainty factor. That leads to average combined factors of around 1,000 that are applied to the lowest observed effect levels. So if you have a certain response, either in animals or in humans, at a certain level you divide it by 1,000, and this is then an exposure level that you consider safe for humans. So this completes my considerations of the evaluation of the evidence, and as you have seen, it's a long path through different sorts of data from the scientific literature, and also a lot of evaluation has to be done based on the medical and physiological and toxicological knowledge. Thank you.
Hi, it's Kylie back again. Do we have any questions from our colleagues?